All right, let's dive into a really fascinating paper from Joshua Gans that tackles a problem economists have been wrestling with for decades: how to properly fit the firm into general equilibrium theory. And this quote from Jacques Drez just perfectly sums up the issue, doesn't it? For our big, elegant models to work, we've often had to take this complex, messy thing we call the firm and basically flatten it until it's unrecognizable. We burst the balloon to make it fit in the envelope. So to really get why this paper is such a big deal, you first have to appreciate this fundamental paradox in GE theory: who actually owns the firm?
Historically, the field has been split. On one hand, you have the Aerodebrew world, where firms are basically just black boxes. They're owned by households, but who owns what is pretty arbitrary, and they just exist to pass profits along. On the other hand, you have McKinsey's view, where firms are nothing more than production functions. With constant returns to scale, they make zero profit, and the entrepreneur isn't a special owner. They're just another input, like labor or capital.
So how does Gans break this theoretical deadlock? Well, the key innovation is to bring a much richer, micro-founded theory of the firm right into the heart of the GE framework.
And that missing ingredient is property rights theory, in the tradition of Grossman, Hart, and more. The idea here is that a firm is really defined by its ownership of non-human assets. And ownership isn't just about getting profits, it's about who has the residual rights of control. Who gets to make decisions when contracts are incomplete, which, let's face it, they always are. Okay, so what happens when you look at the world through this property rights lens? Let's walk through the sequence of the model to see how it all plays out. The model unfolds in 5 stages. Someone invests capital, workers develop firm-specific skills, and then, and this is the absolute game changer, a market for the firm's assets opens up. This happens after the capital is sunk, but before production starts. This stage, right here, is what makes ownership endogenous. And of course, a setup like this just screams hold-up problem. You've got capital that's specific to the firm and workers who are specific to that capital. They need each other. This mutual dependence creates bargaining power, and the model neatly solves for the outcome using the Shapley value. Now, before we get to the really cool part, let's look at the standard benchmarks where ownership is fixed. It's exactly what you'd expect from property rights theory. If the manager owns the firm, the surplus Y is just split 2 ways. If an outsider owns it, there are 3 essential parties, so the surplus gets split 3 ways. The standard intuition here is that manager ownership provides stronger investment incentives. But that intuition gets completely turned on its head once we allow for that asset trading stage. What emerges is a totally different and honestly pretty surprising equilibrium.
So the model's first big prediction makes perfect sense. The agents who have the strongest incentive to actually create firms are the managers themselves. They're the essential, skilled ingredient for production.
But, and here's the twist, the model also predicts that in equilibrium, those very same managers will turn around and sell their ownership to passive, outside investors before production even begins. Okay, let's break down the logic here, because this is the heart of the whole paper. Look at the outsider's willingness to pay. It's simply their entire expected payoff from owning the firm, right? That's 1/3 Y minus 2W. Now look at the manager. Even if they don't own the firm, they still get a wage as an essential employee, which is 1/3 Y plus W. So their willingness to sell isn't their full payoff from ownership. It's just the extra premium they get from owning. And when you do the math, that premium is only 1/6 Y minus 2W. The outsider is willing to pay double what the manager requires to sell. The gains from trade are always there. So why on earth would a manager sell? It really boils down to this. An outsider can only get a return on their investment through ownership. But the manager can capture value in 2 ways. First, from the price they get when they sell the asset, and second, from the wage they continue to earn as an essential employee. That post-exit income stream makes them less attached to the returns from ownership itself. This begs the question, right? If they're just going to sell, why do managers create firms at all? Well, because they anticipate the whole sequence. Their total return isn't just one or the other, it's the sale price they get from the outsider plus their ongoing wage, minus their initial investment. And as you can see, that combined return gives them a much stronger incentive to create the firm in the first place than an outsider would ever have. And the upshot of all this is a more efficient economy. The condition for a manager to form a firm is that the output, Y, is greater than this threshold. And it turns out this threshold is actually lower than in either of the fixed ownership benchmarks. What that means is,
With endogenous ownership, more socially valuable firms actually get created. It's a better outcome.
So this model does more than just explain ownership patterns. It has really profound implications for how we think about the role of the entrepreneur and the nature of the firm itself.
What's so elegant about this is how it reconciles that old theoretical debate. It shows that, in a way, both Mackenzie and Erode-Breu were right. They were just describing different stages of a firm's life. At the moment of formation, Mackenzie's view wins out. Firms are started by an essential factor of production. But in the final equilibrium, it's Erode-Breu's world. Firms are owned by passive, outside households.
And by doing this, the model finally answers William Baumol's famous critique. For years, he argued that general equilibrium theory was like a discussion of Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. The entrepreneur was missing. This paper puts the entrepreneur back on center stage with a distinct, endogenously derived economic role.
And this gives us a much sharper, more precise definition of what an entrepreneur is. They aren't just a generic risk-taker. They're a specific type of agent whose human capital is so valuable to an enterprise that they can create it, sell off ownership, and still capture a chunk of the value as an employee. That unique ability is the very source of their incentive to create in the first place.
And of course, like any great paper, this one doesn't just solve an old problem, it opens the door to a whole host of new, fascinating questions. What happens when you throw financial frictions into this model? Or capital gains taxes? What about the strategic incentive for a founder to make themselves replaceable before an IPO? This framework gives us a whole new way to start thinking about these issues.